was until a few weeks ago, even though it's been in the news and so forth, it was not connected to anything. So there was no reason to understand it the way, the dangers and so forth, the way it truly is, because it's out there just hanging loose. You don't really understand what's going on. As you start putting the pieces of the puzzle together, all of a sudden you begin to realize this is well organized, well orchestrated. They have a plan. It's called Agenda 21 that's been in place now since 1992. President Clinton basically brought it into the United States through the President's Council on Sustainable Development, actually created a number of federal documents in for which he actually changed the mission statements of the various federal agencies dealing with these subject areas. And so now the federal agencies are no longer there to help the American citizens. They're basically there to stop the American citizen from carrying on their normal functions because that supposedly hurts the environment or whatever the case might be.
Let me ask you another question about the role public education or the lack of an education has played in advancing this agenda. And I had Charlotte Thompson Iserby on my show a couple of weeks ago, who had written the book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. So if you would speak to that aspect of it, please, Dr. Coffman.
Back in the late 1800s, truly in the early 1900s, the progressive movement came together. In fact, it was really almost a political party back in the 1910s. And it really began this process of actually deliberately, and it's not in my text, it's not in my book. This book was originally 1,000 pages long, and I had to boil it down to about 220. So I had to leave a lot of critical stuff out, but it has to be short enough to get people to read it. You know, it's not going to be really good as a poem out there. But nonetheless, they started this activity to actually dumb down the American education system so that the actual students coming out, really don't have an appreciation of our history. They don't understand why it's important to have capitalism or the free markets. They don't understand really the history behind the Constitution, what the Constitution truly meant in the minds of the founders. And as a consequence, it's just this whole concept of the founders and capitalism is really no better an idea than, say, socialism is on the other side. In fact, they're always building up the idea of socialism or those kinds of things so that they sound romantic and positive and so forth, and tearing down capitalism or our nation's history, what we actually did, our religious roots and all the rest, so that the actual students do not have, well, they only have half the story. And let me tell you, you cannot make good decisions with only half the information.
No,
and that's what we're seeing today, is a totally dumb, our students are very intelligent, our recent graduates, several generations, they're all intelligent people, but you cannot make good decisions if you do not have the proper education, and we have been totally indoctrinated for the last 100 years. Every generation more successfully than the previous one.
Talk about this impact on the judiciary, if you would, please.
Absolutely. The judiciary is key, along with education. They started with education first because they knew they had to dumb down the average citizen so that they would not be able to recognize what they were doing very insidiously right out in the open. It was right out in the open and nobody really saw it because they didn't have eyes to be able to see it. At the same time, a little bit later on, they begin to work on the judiciary, especially the Supreme Court and our various law schools. Basically, if you go to a law school now and get a degree in law, you might have one course in a very superficial, glossed-over idea of the Constitution. There is nothing really in our law schools that deal with the fundamental character of our Constitution. And so you have lawyers out there that are going basically on the history, or case law as it's called, and of course a smart lawyer can always twist the law a little bit to give them a little bit of advantage, and of course then the next attorney can do the same thing until finally the law that was originally rooted in our Constitution doesn't even look like the Constitution anymore. In fact, in some cases, it's 180 degrees from what the intent of the original Constitution really meant. So what we have seen now is a lot of activism in the part of our judiciary where judges, single judges, are making law right from the bench without any congressional or legislative action whatsoever. And as a consequence, if you have a very biased judge, you can start to see legal interpretations that are radically different from our Constitution. And much of our most recent decisions have been done in that particular way.
Well, the media is controlled by the globalists as well, so they're not going to allow us to be shown the truth. They're going to only allow whatever message they want to be put out there. That's the message that people will hear.
Yes, and I think most people probably in the listening audience are aware of that now. If you weren't aware of it, say in 2000, the last 3 or 4 years, it's been blatantly obvious, horribly obvious, how bad the mainstream media has gotten. And in fact, any resemblance to the truth out of the mainstream media is purely coincidental. They've almost become the ministry of propaganda for the progressive movement.
Well, they're just cheerleaders.
They're cheerleaders. They're actually advocates. They are progressives themselves. Study after study, poll after poll has shown that the media, the reporters and the editors and so forth will vote one way 90%, while the American people will vote 90% the other direction. That's how far apart the worldviews are between the average American and the media. That's why Fox News is just trouncing all of its competition. Basically, it's got better viewership than all of the other media combined.
I know they do.
Unbelievable.
Listen, Dr. Coffman, we're going to go to another break, and we will be back in a couple of minutes. And we are speaking with Dr. Coffman. Dr. Coffman, talk about how you got following sustainable development and how you ended up creating the wildlands map, if you would, please.
Yeah, by all means. I was a scientist. I had to put it in the past tense because I've become a political beast since then. But I was a scientist. I was leading a multi-million-dollar research effort into the effects of acid rain and global climate change, i.e. global warming, back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and realized when the Clean Air Act was reauthorized in Congress that it had no bearing. We had spent something like $5 billion here in this country on that issue in preparation of this reauthorization, and the reauthorization was at least 10 times more draconian than was necessary to do what we found out in the science was wrong. And as a consequence, I started to look at what was actually happening. What was driving this agenda? Because it was obviously agenda. There was no relationship to the science whatsoever. And went into a state of shock as I realized there was this huge agenda to basically tear down the constitutional principles of the United States and institute a socialist doctrine in our government and in our society. And from there began the process of trying. I finally left my job just because I realized it was so critically important for people to understand it that I quit my job because I couldn't do both,
right,
obviously, and quit my job to try to help people understand really what was going on. It was at that time that I was really becoming familiar with what became Agenda 21, was sustainable development, and the Wildlands Project and a number of other things in the early 1990s. I began to draw a map of what the Wildlands Project would be like because I had done work. I'm an ecosystems scientist, have a PhD, and have been in most ecosystems of the United States and know what they wanted to do and begin to draw a map of what that would look like when it was finally completed after 50 to 70 years. And it was about 3/4 of the way through when the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity was being considered for ratification. As a whole story into itself, I'm not going to get into it, but it came down to the last day. I was able to submit that map to the Senate. They blew it up into a 4-by-6 foot poster and literally sent the Senate into a state of shock. And it was withdrawn off the executive calendar. It was never actually voted on. It was so horrifying to realize that their long-term end game was to put 50% of the United States into wilderness. That's what these people truly and honestly believe is necessary to save Mother Nature. Because you're dealing basically, and this is going to be a shock to a lot of you,